Hey class, this is part three. We're going to talk about sculpture and the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. These are some kind of goals that we'll look at is how do Egyptians render the human form, and then what were the purposes of it, and then kind of contrast and compare it to some other types of sculpture as well, and their status in Egyptian society. First one we're going to look at is Khafre enthroned. He is the same guy from the second pyramid. This would have been his serdab. So it had the function to house his ka, and we've talked a bit about this before, but this is an example of one. So it's an actual sculpture statue of him that houses his ka. There's a lot of symbolism that happens in this piece. Has to do with him as pharaoh, and we'll look at different imagery on it. But firstly, I just want to talk about how it's very much almost bilateral symmetry. If you cut it right down the middle, it's almost exactly the same on each side, apart from his hand here, which would have held the nub of a scepter. So it's meant to be a piece that really shows a lot of regal or royal power, and he's very calm, restraint. And you have a whole section in your book that talks about how do you depict, how do they pick to depict people who are like gods on earth, right? If you think about it, this is what they're doing, these sculptors. And the type of ways that they do it last for a really long time because they figure out this is how they want to show them. Down here on the base is our cartouche. You can't see it as well over here, but it's right there. It's the name of Khafre in this roundish circle shape. Let me show you the shape that it is. It's kind of like this. It's named after a cartridge in French. So cartouche. It has the hieroglyph inside of it, and it's a name identifier for Khafre. He has that false beard that we've seen throughout different images, like on Narmer's palette, and he holds a nub of a scepter, like I said there. On his back, though, is interesting. You can see that it's a bird, right? You can see it from different angles. There's the wing, and there you can see it really well. If you remember from Narmer's palette, we talked about how Horus, the hot god, is the protector of kings. Remember, he was helping him defeat the enemy? Well, this is the same god who's been shown depicted in a fully animal form here. He's on his neck as his protector. He wears the same sort of short skirt that we saw kilt on the Narmer palette, so we have a lot of the same symbolism throughout with different pharaohs. They're wearing the similar type things. And he has the headdress that covers the crown, Horus. And then on the base here of his throne are the papyrus and lotus tied together. And that is the symbolism of Upper and Lower Egypt. So he is the king of all of Egypt, the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. It's carrying on with the same tradition that we saw on the Narmer palette, to use two of things to talk about all of Egypt. He's very, very much idealized in his depiction because he's royal and has supreme power for them on earth. And it really shows their idea of the divine kingship. Interestingly enough, you can see he's completely connected to the block of stone. It's not been rounded all the way around. Even though the sculpture is in the round, he is not detached from his throne. You can see the idealized facial expressions. But before I go on to that, why would he not be detached from his throne? It's an interesting idea. Well, one thing is it would keep the body from breaking up, and this statue needed to last forever for them, right? To be able to house his ka. So it prevents breakages, but it also gives an idea that the king and his throne are fully united. So there's kind of a two meanings, one practical and the other one has a symbolic sort of feeling to it, which is interesting. You can see the calm restraint on his face. This is like kingly power and authority. This is how they chose to depict kingly power and authority, through this calm restraint and this sort of idealized proportions of the face and body. This is not a portrait, okay? This isn't something where they're trying to make it look particularly like him necessarily, but as a way of depicting his royalty and his kingly power. So even if he wasn't as muscular as this, or tall, or he didn't have features that were quite as uniform or symmetrical as this, the artist made him look like this because it's depicting his status more than how he actually looked. This is a cool piece that shows sort of an artist's workshop. It shows how they drew and on the front, back, and the two profiles onto a block of stone when they were making these sculptures, and then that the apprentice would chisel away. So this is the drawing right here, and then the apprentice would chisel away and make it into like a block form, and then the master sculpture would do the forming of the figure. So like these would be a total blocks, and then the master sculpture would come in and add the detail. And then after that, at the very end, they would use abrasion. They would grind and sand and rub it to give it a smooth surface. So that's basically the way that they would make these things. And they do have a very blocky structure to them, because they come out of a block, but also because it shows that sort of power that we're looking at. I want to compare it for a second to something we saw from the last chapter, where Gouda is holding the temple plans. And we could talk about how this is way more cubic. I mean, obviously this is round and cubic, but there's a lot more of a cubic sort of feeling to this, and power. They're deciding to show power through like a really kind of cubic rigidity. And this is way more flowing, and the robes and things, it has more of a rounding effect to it, right? So that's something. But they're both, similar in certain ways. They have bare feet. They're kind of like standing on holy ground type of ideas here, and this is a part of that as well. And then they both have symbolism on the thrones that communicate what the piece is about. So there's a lot of similarities. They both are concerned with power and royalty and being seated and regal, and they're both made out of diorite, which is a expensive stone for these guys because they don't have it, and a very hard and luscious stone for them as well. So that takes us through that piece. We're going to look at a piece of Menkaure. That's the guy who had the smallest of the three pyramids. And there's a question mark about this, whether this is his Serdab. People say no, and then I've read some things that say yes, but it's definitely a part of the mortuary cult and worship of him. It's interesting because, again, this is connected to the block of stone to prevent breakage. And an obvious thing right off the bat is that he's with his queen. Okay, this is very interesting because we don't see a lot of things like this. And up until this point, we haven't seen a king with his wife or queen next to him. And this indicates basically that he valued her quite a lot, that she was important to him. She's almost as tall as him, but we still have him being taller, and he's striding further forward than she is. It's kind of a power position, like he's coming at you on the street, like rah. And she isn't as far forward, so she's not as powerful as he is, and she's a little bit smaller in hierarchical scale. So that's kind of some of the symbolism going on here. He's got the same stuff going on, the false beard, the headdress, the kilt. He's very much idealized, just like Khafre was. And but there is a little bit of an interesting relaxed positioning here. She's wearing a dress, but her whole body is shown, so it's obviously skin-tight dress. And it's also to show, this shows their affection as well, though, right? There's like a gathering, not gathering, that's wrong. Her arm is wrapped around him and touching him here. So there's a feeling of closeness and love and care that's also happening in here. I think very much this is a power sculpture as well. It shows his position, but it does something different in the fact that it gives his queen wife power as well and shows how much he cares for her. You can see in this one that there's a little more roundness to it, and we kind of could compare it to, again, the ancient Near East, the same guy, Gouda, with some other pieces of him. There's a lot of similarity going on here, but you could see that this is keeping with all the Egyptian symbols of power, and the style is much more similar to Khafre, but it has, some similarities to other type of sculpture we've seen before. He offers prayer in the temples. He's offering himself in prayer, and this guy is basically more like asking for worship and divinity and an intermediary. So there's a main difference is sort of their attitude towards themselves and the gods. So this one may be holding the soul, the Ka. This one about depicting him as someone who reveres the gods. And you can see that in the posing of the bodies, but there are some similarities in style. So it wasn't just royal people that had sculptures made of them, and also maybe not serdab, only people who had serdabs. This is thought to be possibly a serdab of this scribe. He's seated in a pose that would have been traditional with the first scribe, with his legs crossed. And you see here papyrus that he's writing on, a scroll. This is interesting because the last two people were very idealized version of a person to show royal power. This guy is beginning to feel more like an actual individual person with their idiosyncrasies of their face, the things that are very particular to them, the little bits that make it feel more like a particular person. It's not as monumental, and there's a cutaway to the figure, so it reveals more of the human, who he is and what he looked like. And so we get this idea that lower rank people, like who aren't royal and showing regal royal power, but more like regular people, or still people of position, but not thought to be gods on earth. There's a little bit more of what we would call, individuality, and maybe we could say more naturalism, less idealism, and that's happening here in this piece. It's been painted with limestone. It's painted limestone, I should say. And it's an interesting piece because it feels more like looking at a person from thousands of years ago staring back at you. So that's for the Old Kingdom sculpture in the book that we look at. The Middle Kingdom is interesting. There isn't as much sculpture from this period. There was a period of civil war between the Old and Middle Kingdom, and then Menhotep established central rule again. There are not a lot of works from this time period because the New Kingdom plundered them, and because of this piece not being connected to the whole of it, the whole object, it's a small piece of a larger whole. We don't know the full story of it, but we can say from what we do see that it is more naturalistic in a lot of ways. If you see here, this guy has a calm restraint on his face, like a regal royalty. There's beginning to be some more of an expression and individuality to this guy, with the way the bags under his eyes, sort of the lips. There's a little bit of a feeling of expression happening. And this would be characteristic of the Middle Kingdom because we're thought to be a change happening in their sculptural forms in this way, to be more emotional, have more emotional content, and be more naturalistic in this time period. He was referred to as a shepherd of the people, Senseret, and so there's a sort of feeling that he's showing concern for people, and that a specific sort of personality is emerging. Unlike the earlier stuff that is very clearly about divine royal power, there's a little bit of change happening in this time frame in this sculpture. So that's the only piece from the Middle Kingdom that we look at. And we're going to look at some New Kingdom pieces, but we're going to look at them in their context of some architecture and things. So we'll see some of the changes that happened in that time period as well. Moving on to architecture, we're going to talk about a New Kingdom temple called the Pylon Temple of Amun-Mut Khonsu in Luxor in the New Kingdom era of Egypt. Luxor is the place. Luxor became a place that was an important religious center of the New Kingdom, and this structure was added to by different pharaohs over a period of time. And these people, Amun, Mut, yada, 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 are a Theban god and father of the Theban triad, is Amun. And he became associated with Ra, the sun god, later on, so it became Amun-Ra. So this is a Theban god that became associated with Ra. And this triad that this temple is dedicated to is, this is his wife, and then this is their son. So it's a father and mother, and a son is a triad of Theban gods. And so this was a like important religious center. And different pharaohs added onto it in different ways. And we're going to kind of look at the whole ground plan of it and see it from different angles. This is looking at it from the river side. It probably originally looked like this. Not the best illustration in the world, but these are the things that it gets its name of Pylon Temple from these things right here are the pylons. And there's a couple of them throughout it. You can see it, orange isn't the best color, is it? Look at it with red. Not working for me. So you get the idea of the name of it, Pylon Temple, because of these being the pylons. 1, 2, 3 pylons there. This is if you were looking straight at it, is the next slide. So you're right here, you're looking right at the pylons. And there was a row of lions behind you that you went through. Really interesting. Lions being a symbol of, power, authority, watchfulness. They don't sleep, right? We've talked about this a number of times. And you go up to the front of it, this giant pylon, and there's one of the obelisks is missing. This is an obelisk right here. One of them's missing. And a lot of it you'll see is kind of symmetrical. Each side has something that matches, like statue here, statue there, obelisk here, obelisk there. It has a really, really single approach, like an access up the middle of it. Let's see if you can see. Here, you kind of approach through the whole thing, and it's one single access that gets all the way back. You go up, approaching through until you get to this dark inner sanctuary. This is the idea of it, that it goes from light and open and wide and an avenue of lions and all these grand things into a like dark inner sanctuary type of idea. So at the entrance, besides the obelisk, there's also statues of queens and kings wearing combined crowns of sculpture. And this is kind of the beginning of the march into the whole sanctuary and this space, this transition to more and more sacred space as you go along. I think, if I remember correctly, I'm freestyling right now, but I believe this may be the obelisk. The one missing is the one that's in Paris. I'm not 100% sure, but I think so. If you've seen it there, pictures of it there before, I think that's what that is. And so after you go through the entrance, you go through this hallway with a lot of these really huge columns, and back into it. Everything would have been covered with hieroglyphs, and there's all kinds of incised carving, which is like a relief, but instead of popping out, the carving drops back in, so incised relief. And this is sort of the idea. You go through a courtyard into this, through the avenue of animals, into the hypostyle hall, which is like the main, these are the main important areas right here for them. And this is the part that's pretty amazing architecturally. The clerestory and the hypostyle hall. Your book talks quite a bit about this. This is not the one in Luxor. Okay, so this is the Luxor up to now. They talk about it in the book that there's other ones that are similar to the one you would have seen in Luxor, but there's not a lot left of that you can see. This is the one in Karnak, which would have been similar to what Luxor would have looked like. And these are giant columns. They're actually 22 feet across in diameter. They're giant capitals on them, and they all are covered with hieroglyphs and carvings. You can see how huge this is in comparison to people. And it would have supported, this is like a walk to show you how dark it would have been. It would have supported a roof, and it would have been taller in the middle, because over here are the clerestory windows. This is a model of it. They would have been brightly painted to let light in. Now, this is something we don't think about necessarily very often because we have electric lighting, right? We're not always so concerned about light because we can turn on the lamp and there it is. Before, the economy around light has been studied, and to be able to produce enough light to light a huge space like this would be really difficult, right? You'd have to burn some type of oil or torches. Imagine how much you would need to make this feel lit up. Well, they developed this idea of a clerestory window where they put high up, they put windows by having an extra space up here to allow them to put windows in that would light up this whole, give light into this whole space. And it's something that we see that basically the Egyptians invented architecturally, and it plays an important role up until pretty recent history, and we'll see this type of idea, windows and light and clerestories that go all the way up into the Middle Ages, that they have buildings like this. They would have been really beautifully painted, so if you can imagine going into a space like this with all of these things brightly painted and the light coming in, but still having kind of a dark sanctuary feel. This is a pretty immense and intense and probably quite awe-inspiring type of a space. So that's a New Kingdom temple. We're going to look at another New Kingdom temple. It's a funerary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. So we have, for the first time, a queen, and we're going to see some sculpture of her as well. It's a religious temple to honor her, the dead pharaoh, and her favorite gods and goddesses. It's not a tomb, but a funerary temple. So it's an interesting idea, because you often would think, okay, this is just a burial place, but when you hear the word funerary, you think, oh, she's buried there, but it's not. It's a temple to honor her, so it could be funerary or mortuary, same word. It's interesting because it's 3 platforms that mimic this feeling of the cliff, and they are actually carved into, it's cut into the living cliff along the Nile River. It's pretty rare that we have a woman pharaoh. She exerted power to be pharaoh, and she became pharaoh, but successors tried to get rid of images of her later on because they didn't really like the fact that she had become pharaoh. This shows that sort of feeling right there I'm talking about when you say up each platform mimics the feeling of the cliff going up. So the artisans, the architect who did this was aware of how it was situated in the place and thought about the architecture matching that, and I think that's pretty interesting. There's sanctuaries carved into the hills, and each of them have like small rooms and chambers dedicated to this, the worship of this pharaoh and her favorite gods and goddesses. Inside, there's decorations of paintings and sculpture. I mean, not sculpture, relief sculpture, not sculpture that's left right now, but relief sculpture and paintings. It's pretty amazing piece of architecture. Think about the amount of power you would have to be able to exert your will upon a nation to build something like this before there's modern machinery, right? I mean, we're talking about building these things like the pyramids in a time where it's all manpower, literal manpower and animals, right? There's not diesel engines, there's not cranes helping you out with this type of stuff. So here is Hatshepsut. This is out of granite, 7 foot 11 inches, so she's very tall in this sculpture, way taller than she would have been in life. It has a femininity to it, right? She has some her breasts sort of showing in the way it's done slightly, but it still has a feeling of that same kind of assertive, regal power. There's no beard going on, but there is a headdress, so she has the pharaoh headdress. And her hands are flat on her legs. One of them isn't clenched into fists, but it's still getting a lot of the same type of things across that we had in earlier sculptures. This one is another version of her, but in this one she does have the false beard. And it's very similar to Menkare's in a way, with the stepping forward effect, kind of have a power situation, a feeling of stepping forward in power. You can see that I've compared the sitting one to the earlier one we saw of Khafre, and there's a lot of similarities going on here, but maybe a little less detail in some of the things. There's some incised carving, but not quite as much as this. But you get a lot of similarity. It is practically bilateral symmetry. If you draw a line down the middle of it, it's the same on each side. And it's pretty much following a lot of the same conventions that we've seen before for depicting pharaohs, right? She's not deviating that far, even in these ones. She's looking like Menkaure and his queen. So she's an interesting pharaoh because she was a woman, and there weren't a lot of women pharaohs. One other thing I thought was interesting about this, I forgot to say, is she didn't decide to put Horus on her back, which I thought, that's an interesting thing. She's not necessarily making so many claims about being installed by the divine in these sculptures, but she definitely was in her funerary or mortuary temples, where she was saying, "Here, I am divine, you should worship me," right? And my favorite god. So she's not afraid of doing it, but she decided not to put it on these sculptures. So that's interesting. This is another funerary temple from the New Kingdom, 1300 BC. This was 1500, so a couple hundred years after that. These are for Ramses II. These are, again, not a tomb, but a religious place to honor the dead pharaoh. There's a political element to this piece that the last one didn't necessarily have, in the sense that, not to say it wasn't political, but in the sense to say where it's located. It was actually located in Nubia, which is to the south, and it was invaded by the pharaohs to take over their land and take their resources, and also to capture people as slaves. And so to invade a country and then take their resources and take people as slaves is a very intense and terrible act, right? On top of that, he basically, after doing that, built something that you could say is almost like building Mount Rushmore. It'd be as if we, as a country, invaded Canada and built Mount Rushmore and then took all their money and resources too on top of it. So it's a pretty political, they're all sort of political, you could say, about kingly power, but pretty intense extra level to this one. It's also cut out of the rock, and there's 4 sculptures there. You can see them close up here. That show him in a gigantic scale. This is giganticism. See how small this person is compared to these giant sculptures? And he's got the Upper and Lower Egypt crown. So it's got the same Upper and Lower Egypt combined crown we've seen before, but this is an extreme of hierarchical scale being to the extreme, making something this large. You can see in some of the pictures how far away it is and how big they are. So he's really boosting up this idea of hierarchical scale. The scale being to say how important he is. They're very stiff and rigid. They almost look exactly like the sculptures we've been seeing of like Hatshepsut, just on a really large scale, sitting there like that. And this is the funerary temple inside. It goes into the hill, but it has the same sort of bilateral symmetry almost in each one of them, and he's got a similar position and pose where he's sitting with his hands on his lap. Instead of the headdress, though, we have the whole combined crown. And this is just like Hatshepsut in that it's cut into the rock. This is an interior view of it with all the painting and the statuary and things. It's very, very detailed, complex piece of architecture. Pretty amazing to have something this detailed and well crafted. I mean, he's obviously making a really, really exaggerated case of his importance, right? And who he is and how much people should revere him, basically, right? You can see in these pieces how these people, these pharaohs, believed that they were living gods. To be able to erect this type of a building, you know, of your and statuary of yourself like this, they really did believe that they were living gods. This is interesting, and we're getting into some painting in the New Kingdom era. This is painting inside of a tomb, and it would have been religious in nature because these images were from Nebuchadnezzar's tomb, and this is him hunting birds, and we have sort of his wife and daughter back here. There's an idea for them that the magic of the image is coming to life in the afterlife, so the dead got to enjoy the activities being shown. So it shows a nobleman, Nebuchadnezzar, and his wife and daughter. Again, we get the same idea that we had before with the scribe, that if you're lower in rank, people look more like the people, maybe. There's a little bit more naturalism, and there's some kind of really beautiful, lush painting going on here of wildlife and birds and fish, and it's pretty amazingly done. We still get the same kind of feeling that we have in a lot of the sculpture, that there's this thin line of the ground line. It doesn't have a lot of depth in it. We have the same stylistic conventions, the frontal eye on the side head, the twisted body, where the front of the torso is here. He's got some similar type of dress with this sort of kilt, but obviously no crown or anything like that. He's not trying to say he's a pharaoh. And there's still some symbolism of papyruses and lotuses, Upper and Lower Egypt, as part of this. So even though he's not a king, he's still using a lot of the same type of things that they use, because that's how they depict people. Stylistic conventions go beyond just the king. There's some of them that are about pharaohs directly, like we've been seeing in the sculptures, but there's a lot of them that are just about how they conceptually think about depicting the figure and people. So that's an interesting thing to realize about ancient Egyptian art, that some things are particular ways of depicting like pharaohs or gods with symbols, and then some things apply to all sort of people they depict, like the twisted perspective of the body. We're going to look for a second about another group of paintings that are in Nefertari's tomb in some Valley of the Queens. She was, should say Nefertari, not Nefertiti. There's a Nefertiti as well, so just be aware of that when you're doing your readings. So she's in the Valley of the Queens, and there's a bunch of paintings inside of her tomb. She was a favorite consort of Ramesses II, and the colors on these have been restored, so it has been changed a bit from how it was when they found them. It's plaster on limestone walls, and there's also carved low relief below it, and they would put the pigments on top of it. They're scenes to assist Nefertari into the afterlife. So think about the Book of the Dead and all the type of imagery that would have been in that to help her have an afterlife. This one here is where she's paying homage to the divine scribe, and on his desk is a magic object in the form of a frog and a writing tablet, and this is about him assisting her journey to the afterlife. She wears this white gown that's characteristic, and then there's hieroglyphs here from the Book of the Dead. So there were a lot of paintings from this era. Not all of them survive, but pretty beautiful work. And you can see in all of them that basically the figure is treated very similarly, with a side profile view of the face, a side view of the head and face with a frontal eye, and much of the same type of twisting of the body. So those conventions carry on for thousands of years. There is a few examples of people who broke with it and are well known because of that. One of the ones that broke really strongly with it and is very famous for his totally different type of sculpture, and he tried to also change the religious structure in the country. He was a pharaoh from 1300 BC, roughly. This is Akhenaten. So Akhenaten changed his name from Imhotep IV, and this piece kind of will start to show some of the ideas that he had about how people should be depicted, and we can talk about how those relate to the way he tried to change some of the religious ideas of his empire. So this is a piece that's political to honor the pharaoh. It's stone sculpture in the round, and you have some of the symbolism of kingship that we've seen already, like the combined crown. There's a crook and a flail. The crook part of his body's missing, but this would have been the crook. And this is the flail, which is like a whip. Let me see if I can draw it for you. So the crook is that shape that would have gone out here, like a shepherd's rod almost. And then this is the flail, that's like the whip right there. So Upper and Lower Egypt, two signs, crook and flail. There's a combined crown here, and he has the same sort of kilt. Right here is a cartouche, and you can see the shape of that I was talking to you about before, identifying the pharaoh. And he has that same really large false beard that they all have. So he's obviously using all the symbolism of being a pharaoh. He had a 17-year reign, and he tried to change their religion into a monotheistic, a one-god religion, get rid of the pantheon, and all around the god Aten. And he even went so far as to move the capital. So it's pretty interesting that he tried to change the ideological stuff, but he also changed sculpture. You can see in this that he has elongation in the face, and he's kind of got like a wide hips and almost like a pot belly, and a lot more, I guess you could say, naturalism in a way, but more like he's changed the whole viewpoint of how to show a pharaoh. He's not quite so calm and restrained and so cubic. He's made himself way less cubic, and his face has more of a personality to it. So narrow torso, wide hips, long slender face, and fuller lips. So he really is changing the sculpture plus changing ideas, and so you can kind of see in a way that his ideas about what the religion should be changed, but he also kind of took that further and changed even aesthetic things. He was not popular. His changes were not popular, and after he died, they returned to their old ideals, and later pharaohs who came after him tried to eradicate his images. So there's not as many left as you might have found. This just shows you the change in the elongation of the face and things like that. but he's still keeping some of the same symbols of power. This is an interesting piece because it's Nefertiti, not Nefertari we talked about, but Nefertiti, and this is Akhenaten's wife. This is the first time in the class, I believe, we've seen what we would call a bust, which is like on our way to whatever, or bust, to Yosemite or bust. Bust. B-U-S-T. And what a bust is a sculpture of somebody with their head and their shoulders. So that's what we have going on here. You can see that it's been damaged, the eye has been damaged, but it has a much more realistic style than some of the things we've seen. And there's kind of a feeling of a particular person happening here that I think is interesting. And we can see it almost in the same, her husband's view of how to have a sculpture has more of a particular type of person feeling. And so maybe that was some of their idea with their changing monotheistic religion and also showing the individual we're all connected in some way. Who knows? But we think that this probably was a bust that was made by a sculptor to be able to use for other sculptures, like a study basically, because it was discovered in the workshop of an artist. It's painted stone, so maybe it was something that she sat for in the sculpture studio and they made this piece and then we're going to use it to make other sculptures as well. It has this big crown on her head and a lot of upward thrust type of feeling there. It's pretty interesting, and the eyes and things have a lot of realism to them. Another piece from Akhenaten, very different, is a stele that has a political edge to it, but also shows a totally different idea of family affection. This is him and his wife, Nefertiti, and then they have the two daughters, and there's sort of a feeling of familial affection, like family unit. And then this depiction of the god Aten with the sun rays. It has way more naturalism to it, curving, sweeping lines. There's that pot belly again that he has showing, an elongation. So it's very, very different way of depicting the figure than we've seen, with these curvilinear sweeping lines and sort of a naturalism that we haven't seen with royal people. They're kind of almost slouching. And the god Aten is shown in the middle in a pure geometric form of a circle, not this human and animal combination we've seen. And the kids are almost like miniature adults sitting on their laps, and has a playfulness to it. So obviously this pharaoh who had 17-year reign, he had a different way of depicting himself. His wife was depicted differently, and even they had these political pieces made that were about them and their power and being pharaoh, being king, and that was very different as well. So his ideologies were different, and he used his art differently to talk about what he wanted to and show what he wanted to. And this gives us a really interesting idea that, the way people use art and have used art and continue to use art is oftentimes a lot about communicating their vision of what it means to be human, or what the future holds, or what they think it may hold, or their ideologies about themselves, in this case religious ones, right? Art's been used for that for a really long time, and there's a lot of power in art to communicate. And if you don't believe me, just think about now, media, all the types of media and forms of media that have such a intense social and political power to them. Movies, music, books, literature, all this fine art, visual art, all this stuff, film, it's all got a really, really, really strong influence on our culture, right? So art has been used and continues to be used for these means for a really long time. So the last thing we're going to look at after this is King Tut's tomb. Oh, that's a really good image. I wish I would have pulled that up sooner. I'm sorry. It shows you the stele in a little more detail. It's been damaged. There's obviously some writing around this as well, but it kind of shows you the way they carved it, incised it, and then added more detail. Interesting piece. We're going to look at, lastly, King Tut's tomb, Tutankhamun, also called Tut. He died at 18. He's a relatively minor figure in the history. But why did his boy king's tomb become so famous? That's the question. And we're going to compare maybe some of that to Akhenaten. And then why does it revert back to earlier conventions? That's a question that I want you to think about. But one of the reasons, obviously, is that they didn't like Akhenaten's view of the future and what it meant to be pharaoh, so they didn't want to use his aesthetic, right? It makes sense. You don't want to be associated with the aesthetic of someone who you don't agree with. And so this is, an idea that we could take into a lot of context and think about the fact that, in communist countries, they wouldn't want to be associated with the aesthetic ideals of a free market capitalist necessarily. So, yada yada, vice versa. Hopefully you understand what I'm saying. So this is the Valley of the Kings. There were a lot of tombs there, not just King Tut's. But the reason why this one is so famous, well, there's a couple reasons. The main claim to fame, though, is that the tomb was intact. And in the Valley of the Kings, some of them had been robbed and things had been lost, like mummified bodies weren't there. This one had over 5,000 works of art and objects and a mummified body that was intact and lots of treasure for the afterlife. So this is the main reason why he's so famous, more than actually his role as a pharaoh in the history books of Egypt and his importance in that way. These are old looking pictures because it was found quite a while ago and they had black and white photography back then. There is also the other part of the fame is the fact that the pharaoh's curse, the mummy's curse in popular lore, came about because of King Tut's tomb. So the financier of the excavation died 5 months after. And so this is the idea of the mummy's curse, which you've all heard about at least a few times, I think. Came from this find, this tomb, the excavation of it. So inside of it there were things like boats, chariots, all kinds of chests and things, crooks and flails that were made out of precious materials like gold and gemstones. This is a god depicted. This is a scarab beetle, a jewelry, which was a symbol of eternal life. Inside of here there was also a painted chest that your book talks about, that's interesting, with the boy king as a victorious hunter and soldier on this chest that was intricately made. This is just one object. Think about each of these just singular object, and there were like 5,000 of them throughout this whole thing. Can you imagine? I mean, just the amount of money all this stuff is worth, and think about the amount of craftsmanship and craftspeople who could make this type of stuff in a society. It's pretty incredible stuff. So this shows his canopic coffin with gold and precious gems, an innermost one before the mummy. And he's got the symbols of power, the crook and flail. There's the crook and flail. All the stuff, the vulture and the cobra, Upper and Lower Egypt. And all this stuff is, looking at all this stuff, should bring back all the things we've been talking about with the symbolism about power and the way in which they use art to talk about those ideas, their story, their narrative about the unification of their country, using two things, a vulture and a cobra, a crook and a flail, a lotus and a papyrus. This is what they think he probably looked like based on the what they found, the mummy and things. And kind of artist rendition. So you're looking at the face of, when you're looking at this, you're looking at the face of somebody who actually existed in 1300 BC, which is pretty amazing, really. This is the kind of piece that you've probably seen before. When you think of ancient Egypt, you might have even thought of this piece. a burial mask that was on the mummy. It's a portrait, albeit very idealized, made of gold, lapis, carnelian, and turquoise. Pretty realistic, though, even though it's idealized. It probably looks somewhat like the guy. So that's interesting to think about. And he has the same type of things on this as they do in other depictions of pharaohs, the false beard and the headdress, and all of that type of stuff. This takes us through ancient Egypt, looking into the eyes of an old king that's died in 1300 BC. So, what happened in the country of Egypt? Egypt and Nubia declined, and they became they were conquered, and there's sort of different people who came through. They were conquered by the Assyrians in 673 BC. So, like I said, there's overlap with other chapters of the book, chapter 2. The Persians in 525, and then an overlap with the next chapter we're going to get into here is ancient Greece, and Alexander the Great, who is a Greek emperor king. He conquered them in 323, and then in 58 BC it became part of the Roman Empire, and then ever since the 7th century AD, so way after 58 BC, it's been part of the Islamic world. So that's kind of how Egypt continues on into the future. And obviously, I just told you that in like 200 words or whatever, 45 seconds. So there's way more complexity and intricacy to it. But that's kind of how Egypt declines, and a civilization that was there for thousands of years just eventually declined from within and conquering by different people groups. So that takes us through ancient Egypt. I hope you guys are staying safe and well out there, and make sure you're reading the book, all the different pages in your course outline. All right, take care.